Hi, Pastor Mark Quick here with you again to talk about a Christian perspective on dating. And we've talked about this off and on during different sessions, but I want to talk to you today about sexual purity. But before, I want to give you a list. I found this as Pastor Chip Ingram some years ago, and I like this list. I want to share it with you. It's 7 habits of highly defective dating. First of all, dating tends to skip the friendship stage of a relationship. We tend to focus on coupleness rather than common interests. Dating, number 2, often mistakes a physical relationship for love. We get wrapped up in the passion before we really know the person. Thirdly, dating often isolates a couple from other vital relationships. If we make our decisions about life based solely on the influence of one relationship, we will probably make poor judgments. Number 4, dating can distract young adults from their primary responsibility of preparing for their future. Number 5, dating can cause discontentment with God's gift of singleness. We need to learn to be a happy and fulfilled single person before we move forward. Number 6, dating can create an artificial environment for evaluating another person's character. We need to see people in real life settings of interacting with family and friends and authority figures and at work and at church. And finally, number 7, dating often becomes an end in and of itself, a pretend marriage. So I want to talk to you about countercultural romance and sort of a policy and procedure for dating. First of all, every relationship is an opportunity to model Christ's love. My unmarried years, number 2, are a gift from God. I don't need to pursue a romantic relationship before I'm ready for marriage. God has made each of us with a desire for intimacy, and He needs to fill that first. It's unfair for us to expect another human to be what only God can be to us. Let me stop there for a second. Again, I realize that my wife, Angelica, has been a great blessing in my life, and I thank God for her. But I cannot put her in the position of being God. I can't expect her to do what only God can do. Only God can bring ultimate fulfillment and peace in my spirit. And so we need to be careful there. Fourthly, I cannot own someone outside of marriage. Making claims on a person's time, attention, and future before marriage is unwarranted. And number 5, I will avoid situations that could compromise the purity of my body and of my mind. So I want to come back to something that, of course, is very critical, and that is the importance of sexual purity. Let me read to you 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. It says, "Finally, brethren, we urge and exhort in the Lord Jesus that you should abound more and more, just as you receive from us how you ought to walk and to please God. For you know what commandments we gave you through Jesus Christ. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you should abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you should learn how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles or the pagans who do not know God, that no one should take advantage of or defraud his brother in this manner, because the Lord is the avenger of all such, as we also forewarned you and testified. For God did not call us to uncleanness, but to holiness." So sanctification is a theological term that means to be set apart from what is evil and unto God's service. And in this text and others, of course, in the Word of God, it shows us that sexual immorality defiles us. And God wills that we should learn to control ourselves. Let me say this. We think that marriage will control us. We think that if we have a spouse and we have sexual opportunity, that all the tension will go away. But if we cannot control ourselves outside of marriage, oftentimes we cannot control ourselves in it. It's unreasonable. This is evidenced by the numbers of affairs and divorces. Sex outside of marriage is, sex outside of God's will is using someone else. It's defrauding from them and taking away from them. Purity is a direction, not a set of boundaries. When we speak of holiness, people often think of bitterness and of misery and of deprivation. Or of lines, strict boundaries. But I want to encourage you that it's more than that. If we're honest with ourselves, many of us would admit we're not interested in purity at all. Instead, we are content meeting the minimum requirements. We flirt with risk and with darkness rather than avoiding it. This illustration has blessed my life, and that is one that's taken from Joshua Harris's book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, and that is, imagine wearing a white suit If you're wearing a white suit, you avoid mud puddles. You don't dance as close as you can get to the edge without getting dirty. For my own sake, just imagine it's picture day, and your mother's dressed you up, and she's combed your hair, and she's got you all freshened up and ready for school. You want to avoid getting in a tussle with your neighbor. You want to, look good for the photograph, and so purity is not just about boundaries, and oftentimes that's what we're focused on. I did this experiment with a group of teenagers when I was pastoring in Southwest Houston area, and that was, I asked them, I had a whiteboard, and this was kind of awkward, but I asked them, I said, what is allowable in a relationship with the opposite sex? And I just started writing on the whiteboard. Is it okay to hold their hand? Yes or no? Is it okay to hug them? Is it okay to kiss them? And is it okay to kiss them with the tongue? Is it? They were getting embarrassed. They're like, Pastor Mark, what are you doing? What are you asking us? I said, well, what I'm asking you is, where is the boundary in your mind? Where is it that you can go up to, and as long as you don't cross that boundary, you think that you're okay? Well, that's not really the idea of purity. Purity is not how close can I get to the edge without falling off. Purity is not how close I can get to the cliff without falling off, or how close I can come to the border without going across. Purity is moving in a direction, and it's another way of describing it is, imagine that you're in a room and there's a fireplace, and the closer you get to the fire, the more warmth you feel and the more light you have. And if you come in from a cold winter day and you're wearing coat and sweaters and scarves and hats, and you walk into the room and you immediately begin to shed those things. You begin to take off your outer coat, you begin to take off your hat, you begin to take off your scarf. And the closer you get to the fire, the more relaxed you become. When you come in from the cold, you're tense, and when you get closer to the fire, you begin to relax, you're warm, you feel the warmth of the fire and the light. And I want to propose to you that that's what our walk of holiness is like. As we move towards the Lord, as we move towards intimacy with Christ, as we draw nearer to Him, it's like we're drawing nearer to that fire. The closer we come to the Lord, the more light we have and the more warmth we have, the more things we take off. It's not about how close can I get to the boundary, or is there a rule, I can do this and this and this, but I can't do this and this and this. It's not so much about that. It's more about pleasing God in our relationships and drawing nearer to Him. And as we draw nearer to Him, these things become, we begin to shed these things in our life. Purity is a direction, a persistent, determined pursuit of righteousness. This direction starts in the heart, and we express it in a lifestyle that flees opportunities for compromise. When we view purity as a line not to cross, what is to keep us from going as close to the edge as we can? I'll have a frank conversation with you. I don't care if you are a born-again Christian, if you are a Spirit-filled Christian, if you are a very godly person. If you place yourself or allow yourself to be placed into a situation where you're alone with a member of the opposite sex, and you begin touching one another, you begin kissing one another, let me tell you what's going to happen is heart rate's going to increase and sexual arousal will occur, and one thing may lead to the next. So what we've done in that situation is we've pushed ourselves up to the boundary. How close can we get without going over the edge? Actually, if we're really going after the Lord, if we're really pursuing purity, if we're really moving closer to the fire, we would avoid that situation in the first place, wouldn't we? Going into that situation is not going to draw me nearer to the Lord. It's going to create a context for me to get close to the edge, and as much as I might think I'm strong, I'd be wise to not get close to the edge and fall off. If you're on a cliff on the side of a mountain, you'll back yourself up against the sheer face of the cliff to get away from the edge. The further you can get from that edge, the better, so that you're less likely to fall. Living a pure life before God requires a teamwork of our heart and of our feet. A man and a woman who commit their lives to each other in marriage gain the right to express themselves sexually to one another. A husband and a wife may enjoy each other's bodies because they in essence belong to one another. Listen to what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 3 to 4. It says, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. We belong to one another in marriage, and because we've made that commitment and have a covenant with one another, we have that right. We have that that opportunity. And we need to set our standards high. We must not allow sin to conceive. You know, James chapter 1 says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So we need to flee temptations. In 2 Timothy 2:22, Paul told Timothy, flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. So don't let yourself be fooled. He says in James 1, God does not tempt anyone. We allow the seed of sin to be born in us, and as it grows and it produces, James says, death. Notice again this statement of direction we find in 2 Timothy 2:22. Flee evil desires. Move in the opposite direction. Move towards the Lord and away from those things that will compromise us in our walk with God and in our purity. So, in practical terms, I would encourage you that it's better to go out in groups and dating relationships. It's better to avoid settings of one-on-one isolation. We must make the purity of others a priority of our own. Without purity, the mind becomes a slave to depravity, tossed about by every sinful craving and imagination. And so we'll benefit from accountability, as we talked about in our first session. We should focus on friendships with the opposite sex and do this by being inclusive rather than exclusive. That is, again, groups before one-to-one. We find victory when we practice guarding our heart. Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. When you let God be God, you can let humans be humans. Recognize that when we lust, we are setting our hearts on something that God has set off limits. We need to trust that He is good and wise and has set boundaries for us. You know, as a parent, as I mentioned earlier, I have 4 children. My wife Angelica and I have 4 grown children. And as a father, there were times when we would play not in the street. Actually, we'd play in the front yard or in the house, and I would tell the kids not to cross a certain boundary, not to go into the street, for example. And let me tell you that my thinking was not, there's just so much fun to be had out in the street that I want to rob my children of it. No, actually, I know there are cars traveling back and forth, and people don't always pay attention, and that was dangerous for them. So God has set boundaries for us, not because He's trying to keep us from experiencing some pleasure or benefit, but because God knows what's best for us. So we don't need to worry about impressing the opposite sex. We need to focus on impressing God, and you will catch the attention of other people who have the same priorities. Again, as I said before, run after Jesus. Go after the Lord with all of your heart, and then look to the right and to the left and see who's around. Let me say this, and I want to encourage you, if you're considering getting married, many adults have a view of marriage that is limited and unreal. One of the things I do in pre-marriage counseling with couples is I forbid magical thinking. You know, we're going to talk about reality here. We're going to talk about the reality of married life. We're going to talk about the reality of communication and what to expect in marriage. Many adults have had no real example of what a marriage is supposed to be. The family of origin, and I want to say this, I'm hopeful that my children grew up with a good example of marriage, and I hope that they're blessed from that. But many times people grow up and they don't have the example of what a godly marriage looks like, how a husband relates to a wife, how a wife relates to a husband, how conflicts can be engaged in and resolved in a Christ-like manner. So we need godly mentors and counselors to help us to get a proper orientation and a vision. So I want to encourage you in this pursuit of purity, in this pursuit of wisdom, that you think of it, that you think of holiness, that you think of purity, not as a boundary line that you can get close enough to without going over, but rather as a direction of your life, moving towards the presence of God, moving towards intimacy with God, just like moving towards that fire in that illustration that I gave you earlier, and looking for those that can speak into your life and give you counsel and give you advice. If you're considering marriage, I strongly encourage you to find a pastor, someone that can walk you through a process of preparing for that next season and next stage of your life. So I want to say to you, I appreciate so much the time that I've had with you. I appreciate us sharing these things together. Please post comments and let me know how this teaching has been an encouragement to you, if you have other thoughts. And also you can learn more about me and my ministry and communicate with me more directly through my website, pastormarkquick.com. During one of our sessions, I mentioned my book, Imitators of God, the subtitle being Making Your Life and Relationships Count for Eternity. I say this humbly. I'm so encouraged from the feedback that I've gotten from this book and people saying how it blessed them. It's really great, especially for people that are getting started in their walk with God. And it talks about how we can view our relationships through the prism of God's view, and add value to others, and every relationship become a source of growth for us and for those that are around us. I believe the truths that we learned from Ephesians chapter 5 and chapter 6, which are the foundation and the core of what I write about in Imitators of God, knowing those truths can elevate us to a place of being a great blessing in our families, in our churches, in our workplaces, in our society, and can cause us to make significant progress, growing and learning how to be like Christ in our relationships. So we thank God for you. We thank God for what God's going to do in your life. We believe that God is going to lead you. He's going to order your steps as you walk with Him into His perfect plan and His perfect will for your life. In Jesus' name, amen.